Good afternoon, guys. This is Econ 358, chapters 13 and 14 lecture video. This is actually the last lecture video of the semester, so congratulations for making this far, and I hope you're not one of the few that watch these videos. Well, if you are, then I guess you definitely have an advantage on doing better on the final exam. So anyway, let's look at these last two chapters, okay? So chapter 13 is about exchange rate adjustments and balance of payments. And the idea is, well, when exchange rates changes, how does that, affect production and the markets and firm behaviors and imports and exports and all that, right? So the first thing we want to look at is, well, how does, an exchange rate adjustment affect firms when they produce either with no foreign sourcing, that means everything is made in America, right? If we're talking about the US firms, and versus they do have some foreign sourcing, right? Your book has a pretty detailed example on a steel firm, but I want to make up another example. So let's say that we're looking at Tesla. Okay, let's say Tesla, okay, produces vehicles, and then in this case, let's assume they sell mainly to China. Okay, now if we look at Tesla's cost of production, okay, and let's say we're going to compare two time periods where there's some kind of change in the exchange rate, right? The first one is period 1, and during which, let's say, it's 5 yuan equals $1, okay? So, or another way to look at this is 0.2, okay, so $0.2 per yuan, okay, either way. And let's say in period 2, okay, the dollar appreciates by 100%, okay, where now it only takes 10 cents or a dime for 1 yuan, or another way of looking at it is that it takes 10 Chinese yuan for a dollar. Okay. Now first, let's assume there's no foreign sourcing. Okay. So no foreign sourcing. That means everything is made in America. Okay. So if this is the case, okay, let's say that first of all we have labor costs. Okay. Then we have materials, okay, so batteries and metal tires and all that. And let's say we have utilities, okay, you have to pay for utilities for your costs. And then let's just say this is the total, okay, there is, to keep your calculations a little simple. And then we have percentage change. We want to calculate how much things change with different scenarios. Okay, so let's say that now at first, okay, we want to look at the cost in the dollars and then the yuan equivalent. Okay, and we'll look at that for period 1. Okay, let's say since period 1, everything we said is made in America, and to make every Tesla, let's say they pay $5,000 in labor, which is the equivalent of 25,000 yuan, okay? And the materials maybe, let's say, 3,000, okay? And that gives you 15,000 yuan, okay, equivalent. And let's say utilities is $1,000, and that gives you 5,000 yuan. Okay, so the total for making a Tesla then is $9,000. Okay, and that gives you 45,000 yuan equivalent in cost. Okay, so there's no percentage change yet. Okay, so that's what it looks like. Now, let's say the dollar appreciates by 100%. Okay, so we enter period 2. Everything's still made in America, but we sell Teslas in China. So let's look at how this impacts Tesla's market in China. Okay, so again, we look at the dollar value for their different costs and their yuan equivalents. Okay, so labor, well, the dollar appreciating doesn't change the labor measured in dollars. Okay, it's still 5,000, but now that is the equivalent of 50,000 yuan. Okay, and similarly, materials is still $3,000, but now that is 30,000 yuan. Okay, and utilities they pay is still $1,000. Now that's 10,000 yuan. Okay, so the total cost for producing a Tesla is still $9,000. Okay, but now in China they have to sell their product for 9,000 yuan. I mean, sorry, 90,000 yuan or more. So the dollar cost had no percentage change, but okay, the Chinese equivalent cost increased by 100% just because of the dollar appreciation. So that means even though nothing seemed to change domestically back at home in California, but when they sell their cars to China, they face a serious problem because their costs have doubled in Chinese yuan. So they have to figure out what to do in that market, whether they need to double their price or take a hit or whatever the solution is, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the point is, okay, when there's no foreign sourcing, you take 100% of the hit by any change in your domestic currency, right? Whatever currency you use to measure your cost, okay? Now let's look at what happens if Tesla actually has some foreign sourcing, right? So we have the same table essentially, right? So let's see, let me just use, continue this, right? So let's say now we have, okay, some foreign sourcing. Okay, let's say that we now have materials, okay, made in China. Okay, so we still use U.S. labor. We still have factories in the U.S., but the metals and batteries are actually made in China. Okay, so again, let's start with, okay, the two different periods. I'm just going to do period 1 here and period 2 here, so it's exactly the same exchange rates and everything. Okay, so labor, also again this is dollar and yuan equivalent, dollar and yuan equivalent. Okay, so labor, okay, is still $5,000, and in period 1 we said that is the equivalent of 25,000 yuan. Okay, and materials, okay, is measured in Chinese yuan, and let's say in period 1 it's still 15,000 yuan. Now that means it's the equivalent of $3,000. Okay, utilities is still $1,000, which is the equivalent of 5,000 yuan. Okay, so the total is still, okay, $9,000. Nothing has changed, and the equivalent of $45,000. I mean yuan. Okay, and if we do percentage change, then there's no change yet. In period 2, again, the dollar appreciates by 100%. Okay, so that means labor, which is denoted in dollars, is still 5,000, but then again, yuan equivalent increases to 50,000. Okay, and materials now, okay, because materials are made in China, the dollar appreciation doesn't impact the cost in China. So it's $15,000 in yuan, and so at the new exchange rate of 10 yuan per dollar, that means the dollar equivalent is 1,500. Okay. Now utility is still measured in dollars of 1,000, so that goes to 10,000 here in yuan. So the total here, you can see we have gone from 9,000 down to 7,500. Okay, and then the total in yuan is now 75,000. Okay, so compared to before, the dollar cost went from 9,000 to 7,500, and if you do the math, okay, that is a 16, so negative, well, or decrease, let's see, let's do negative 16.67% change in dollar denominated cost. And for the Chinese yuan equivalent, okay, we increased from 45,000 to 75,000, so that is a 66.67% increase in Chinese yuan cost. Okay, so compared to before, just because now we have materials sourced in China, okay, the dollar appreciation actually decreases our cost relative in dollars, and then the increase in Chinese yuan is a lot less than what it was before compared to 100% with no foreign sourcing. So this kind of shows you how, when companies have foreign sourcing, they kind of shield themselves from the full impact of currency value fluctuations, right? So, and that explains why there's so many firms that now are multinational, right? Because when you have sources of costs from different countries or denominated in different currencies, then you kind of put your eggs in multiple baskets and you don't get hit if one of them drops, right? So that's kind of how it works, the difference between having one currency denominating all your costs or having multiple, okay? So now some common strategies. Your book gives examples about how Japanese firms versus American firms, what they did in the face of currency appreciation. But some general approaches are to establish transplants in a different country, okay, or you outsource your production to a cheaper cost third country, right? So let's say, if the Japanese yen appreciates, then Toyota could establish more factories in the U.S. Since U.S. is their biggest market, to make sure some of their costs is denominated in dollars. That's one solution. Or they can build factories in China or Vietnam where the costs are just low, no matter what, and then or they can just take a hit and have smaller profit margins in order to maintain their market share in a major country like the US, right? So those are all possible outcomes when a company faces currency appreciation in their domestic nation. Okay, all right. Now let's talk about the three approaches that evaluate the effects of currency depreciation on trade deficits. So the idea is that, well, for example, China has long been accused of intentionally depreciating the Chinese yuan so that they can have an advantage in trade, right? The idea is if you make your currency less valuable, then your exports will be cheaper to foreigners, so foreigners will buy a lot of exports, and then imports will be relatively more expensive, so you don't have to import as much. So if you export more and import less, that helps grow your real GDP, right? And this is something that you learn in Econ 151. I hope that still rings a bell. So that's the general belief, right? But the question is, well, does that actually work, right? Depreciating your currency, will that actually help your real GDP grow? So there are three ways of looking at the effects of such approach, because like I said, many countries, especially China, being the second largest economy in the world, have been accused of intentionally devaluing their currency to gain an advantage in trade, okay, or at least to reduce the trade deficit, right? That's something that maybe some people are proposing here. Let's make the dollar depreciate so we can get rid of or make our trade policy, trade deficit smaller. Okay. Now the three ways to look at if this will work or not. Okay. One is called the. Let me change a different color. Sorry, I don't like red. Okay. One is called the elasticity approach. Okay, and let's talk about this one first. This one is the biggest one, most technical. The next two are called the absorption approach and the monetary approach, which we'll go over those specifically. Okay, so the elasticity approach emphasizes the relative price effects of depreciation on your demand for imports and foreigners' demand on your exports. Okay, so before we get into the details of that, a quick recap. So elasticity here refers to the price elasticity of demand, which measures how quantity demanded changes when price changes. So this is introduced from, Econ 150. So if it doesn't ring a bell, go find Wikipedia or Khan Academy to review this concept quickly, right? So the elasticity is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price, right? Triangle or delta means change, and then with a percent sign is percentage change. So that to calculate percentage change in quantity demanded, you have the change in quantity demanded divided by, okay, quantity demanded itself, and the change in price divided by price itself. That's how you figure it out, okay? Now, if elasticity is greater than 1, we say that the demand is elastic, okay? That means quantity change will always be bigger than price change, right? Price changes a little will cause a lot of quantity change, okay? If E equals 1, we call that unit elasticity or unit elastic. That means quantity and price changes are always going to be the same, right? If price increases by 10%, quantity will always decrease by 10% and vice versa. By the way, they always go in opposite directions, right? When price drops, quantity will increase. When price increases, quantity will decrease. That's due to the law of demand. So I'm not going to go into great detail. I expect you to know that by now, okay? Now, if elasticity is less than 1, we call that inelastic demand. And that means when your price changes, your quantity changes less than that, right? So if price increases by 10%, quantity demanded will decrease by less than 10%, okay? So that's a quick recap on elasticity. Now, apply to examining the effects of currency depreciation on trade balance, okay, we use something called the Marshall-Lerner condition, okay? So Marshall-Lerner condition is this theorem that looks at exactly how the elasticity can be used to measure the trade effects. And it says that depreciation of your currency will only work in improving trade balance if, okay, the absolute value of your elasticity for imports, okay, so how much dependent you are on buying things from other countries, and the elasticity, absolute value of the elasticity foreigners have on demanding your exports. If those two elasticity absolute values add up to more than 1, then depreciating your currency will help you improve your trade balance. But if they add up to less than 1, then it will actually backfire and make your trade balance even worse. Of course, if it equals 1, then it doesn't change. Okay, so essentially, okay, the basic idea here is that, oh, sorry, I just realized it's not Marchall, it's Marshall. Okay, so the basic idea is that it depends on, okay, your elasticity of both, your elasticity of demand on imports and foreigners' elasticity of demand on your exports. And we look at the sum of those absolute values. We look at absolute values is because, you know, these elasticities, which said are always negative, right? Because price and quantity changes are always going in opposite directions. So one of those numbers is always a negative number. So that's why we take the absolute value. Okay. All right. So now, okay, let's look at how that works, right? So let's say that we're looking at the United Kingdom, okay, and let's say that imports, okay, their elasticity is 2.5, okay. On exports, so imports elasticity means that's how much British people depend on their imported goods, and exports elasticity, so I'll do the E of imports and E of exports. Okay, so export elasticity, let's say, is 1.5, so that means that's how much foreigners depend on English products. Okay, and together, you know, these are already absolute values because they're always negative, so often it's customary to just drop the negative sign. But together, okay, your sum is 4.0, right? So if this is the case, let's look at the effects of the UK intentionally depreciating the pound and what's going to happen, right? So if we look at the imports and exports, okay, and let's say the percentage change in price in pound, okay, pound price, so this is measured in pound because they cannot change the value of currencies of anybody else, so this is the change in quantity as a result, okay, and then we have the net effects of what happens. Okay, so let's say that in the United Kingdom decides to depreciate their pound by 10%. Okay, if they do that domestically, well, I can't say domestically, I should say if they do that, the price of imports, okay, will increase by 10%, right? Because if the pound depreciates by 10%, that means British folks have to spend 10% more in pounds to buy the same products as before, right? So now, because of the elasticity, okay, a higher price of 10% than before will actually cause a negative 25% in quantity imported, right? Because the price went up by 10%, measured in pounds, and the elasticity 2.5, so that means folks will buy 25% less of imports from other countries, okay? So overall then, that means there's a negative 15% spending, okay, on imports, right? Because you buy 25% less, but you pay 10% more, so overall you spend 15% less in imports. Now, exports, okay, so there's 0% change on the pound price of exports, okay, but in foreign, so pound prices don't change, but to foreigners, it does take 10% less of their own currency to buy the British products now because of the 10% depreciation. So because it is 10% cheaper to foreigners, according to the elasticity of 1.5, you're going to have a 15% increase in exports, how much you sell to other countries, okay? So that means that overall you get 15% of, okay, what should we call that? I'll say export, revenue, if you will, okay. And now overall then, okay, if you are spending 15% less on foreign products and foreigners are spending 15% more on your products, so the net effects would be a plus 30% on your trade balance. I'll just do TB for trade balance, right? Because now you're selling more to other countries and spending less on other countries' products. So exports increase by 15%, imports decrease by 15%. Trade balance or net exports equals exports minus imports, right? So this increases by 15, this decreases by 15, so overall this will increase by 30, right? That's how I got there, okay? So now maybe it's better to do, plus and minus. Okay, so do 15%, and this is minus 15%, right? So 15% minus negative 15% is 15% plus 15%. That's how I got 30. Okay, so that is how we use the elasticity approach to look at what happens to your trade balance when you depreciate the pound, okay, by 10%. Okay, now let's say that we are depreciating the pound by 10%, just like before, like we just talked about, but the elasticities are actually different. Okay, let's say that your elasticity of imports for England is no longer 2.5, but it's 0.2. Okay, so that means we're very inelastic on imports. So that means the British are very dependent on imports. Okay, when price increases by 10%, they only buy 2% less of imports. Okay, and then the elasticity of exports, let's say, is 0.1, which means foreigners are even more dependent on British exports. Okay, so if that's the case, the sum obviously is only 0.3. So let's look at what happens here, right? Again, they depreciate the pound by 10%. Okay, so let's look at what happens to imports and exports. Okay, so again, you have the change in the pound price versus the change in quantity, and then we look at the net change. Okay, so again, okay, when you have 10% pound depreciation, import prices measured in pounds is going to increase by 10%, right? Because pounds are worth less, and it now takes you 10% more to buy the same products from other countries. And because of that, okay, according to our elasticity of 0.2, that means only 2% decrease in quantity will happen on imports. Okay, we buy 2% less of imports because imports are now 10% more expensive. So the net change is that we're going to spend 8% more on imports or import spending, right? Okay. Now, similarly, if we depreciate the pound by 10%, the pound price has no change, but to foreigners, their foreign prices decreases by 10%. So according to our elasticity, they will buy more by 1% more of your your exports. So this is plus 1% in export revenue. Okay, so then the total change in net exports, right? That equals your change in your exports, which is 1%, minus the change in your imports, which is 8%, and that gives you negative 7%. Okay, so the net change is negative 7% on your trade balance. Okay, so that is because here the elasticities are so low. When you change, when you depreciate your currency, you still have to import very much, and foreigners don't export. I mean, don't buy your export very much more. So overall, you end up spending on more imports than you earn from exports. So in this case, when the sum of your elasticities actually is less than 1, you, according to the Marshall-Lerner condition, you could hurt your trade balance by depreciating your currency. So this is a strategy that does not work for every country. Okay, your book has a table listing the price elasticities of demand for imports versus exports for different countries. Okay, you can see that for the U.S., for example, we're very dependent on imports. We have a 0.3 elasticity, but we are very elastic on exports. It's 1.5. So overall, it's 1.8. So that means if we were to depreciate the dollar, we could improve our trade balance. Okay, but other countries like Japan or Germany, they are very inelastic in both. So they don't want to depreciate their currency, and that actually can explain some of the countries' behaviors where, the euro, for example, for the longest time was accused of being overvalued, right? Because that is to help them with their economic situation. Okay. All right. Now, so that's how elasticity approach works in theory, but in reality, okay, we have what's called the J-curve effect. The J-curve effect says, well, when you do currency depreciation, even though the elasticity approach tells you that you will improve your trade balance, but in the short run, it actually hurts it before it gets improved. And that is because, well, there are lags between when you make the currency depreciated to when actual trade volumes will change, right? Because everything in trade is locked down by contracts, and also it takes time for companies' production and policymakers to make adjustments. So that means oftentimes you will see your trade balance worsen and then improve. That's why it's called the J-curve effect. Okay, so some of the lags that you could encounter to cause this, right? First of all, there's recognition lag, right? It takes time to realize that your market conditions have changed because of the exchange rate. Decision lag, so that's when you have to form new business connections and placing new orders with your changed market conditions. The delivery lag, right? It takes time for new orders to be placed and for their impacts on trade and payment flows are felt. And then you have the replacement lags. That's when you have to use up the inventories and wear out existing machinery before you can place new orders. And the production lag, and that's when you have to be involved in increasing the output of commodities, and when the demand is increased, but it takes time, right? So all these things make it that actually oftentimes when the exchange rate first alters, your trade condition does not improve immediately, but it worsens first, and then you see the effects kick in and things improve. Okay. Now, another thing that can play into this to explain why it does not work very well is something called exchange rate pass-through. Okay, exchange rate pass-through. Okay, so exchange rate pass-through is this idea that, well, if my my currency depreciated by 10%, then I would expect to see all imports will cost me 10% more, right? The price at Walmart, since they import almost all their products from China and other countries, if the dollar depreciates by 10%, I should expect the prices at Walmart to all go up by 10%, right? When that happens, that's called exchange rate pass-through, and where all the changes in the exchange rate will be reflected in the prices you see. However, okay, sometimes we don't see the complete exchange rate pass-through. We see what's called a partial exchange rate pass-through, meaning that, well, if the dollar depreciated by 10%, but I only saw a 4% increase in the prices at Walmart. So what happened to the other 6%? There are a few different reasons for that, okay? One, it depends on the producer's invoicing practices. Okay, so what I mean by that is, well, even though the manufacturer might be in China, they might have decided to keep their accounting and their revenue and payments and revenue receipts all measured in dollars. So instead of accepting Chinese yuan for payments, they've always just paid and accepted dollars as part of their production. So if a foreign producer has invoicing practices measured in the dollar, then the dollar depreciation does not affect them nearly as much. Kind of like the first example we did with Tesla, having some foreign source of cost. Similar idea here, right? So that can be why, right? Maybe part of the production is shielded from fluctuation of the dollar exchange rate. Okay, another one is market, okay, share considerations. So that means, well, for these Chinese producers, the US and Walmart are such a big part of their clientele, they are afraid of raising their prices by 10% and lose a big part of the market share, right? What if a Vietnamese producer, slides in and takes over? So instead, they take a hit. They say, okay, the dollar has depreciated and our price needs to go up by 10% measured in dollars, but I'm afraid of losing too much market share. So what's the slowest or smallest increase in price that we can afford without getting too hurt financially? And they decide, you know what, let's take a hit of 6% in our revenue, and we'll only raise the price by 4%. Right, so that can be another reason. Okay, and then finally we have distribution, okay, costs. So what I mean by that is, well, actually a lot of the price you see at Walmart is not reflecting the cost of production in China, but rather, okay, how much it costs to bring that product from China to your Walmart shelves in Rexburg, okay? And that distribution cost can account for a big chunk of that price you see. Your book talks about how, in America, if a Barbie doll is $10, the Chinese producers only get like $3 or something. $7 comes from the U.S. truckers that take these products across the country. So in that case, well, when you have a 10% depreciation on the dollar, you're only going to see the 10% reflected on the $3 part of the Chinese manufacturing. The $7 in U.S. domestic transportation will not be affected by the exchange rate altering, right? So that's another reason why we only see partial exchange rate pass-throughs. Okay. All right. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Okay. Now, let's see. Okay, let's talk about the absorption approach. So, absorption approach. Okay, so again, this is to look at, this is to look at if depreciating your currency will help you with your trade balance, okay, just from a different angle. Now we want to look at the impact of depreciation on spending behavior in your domestic economy and how that influences the domestic spending on trade as well, okay? So if you recall, we said real GDP, often denoted by Y, that is your total production, right? And your total spending, we said, comes from 4 sources: consumption, which is spent by households, plus investment, which is spent by firms, plus government spending, plus net exports, which are exports minus imports. So that is the spending in our economy from the rest of the world, right? So how much we pay them minus how much they pay us. The difference is how much we actually gained in the trade into our own economy. So we said at equilibrium, these two equal, right? GDP, your total production equals your total spending, okay? Now, if we regroup this a little bit, okay, if we call C plus I plus G A for absorption, okay, and then X minus M, this is your balance of trade, so call it B, okay, so then we can just rewrite this as Y equals domestic absorption plus B trade balance, right, because C, I, and G are all domestic spending, so that's why we call it absorption. It's spent, that's our real GDP bought up domestically, okay? Then X minus M, that's how much of our GDP got bought by foreigners in net, okay? So we can rewrite this a little bit, and well, if we rearrange this one more step, okay, we get B, the trade balance, equals Y minus A, right? So this is saying, well, how much we sell in international trade, in net effects equals our total production of GDP minus whatever we bought domestically. The rest is sold to foreign countries. Right? Hopefully that makes sense. Right? So now the question is, well, if I were to depreciate my currency, can I increase B? Right? Because the idea is, if we depreciate our currency, will it help our trade balance improve, right? So that's the goal, but the question is, will that happen? Okay, now that turns out depends on where we are in terms of our economic condition, right? So if, first of all, if we have unemployment, okay, meaning cyclical unemployment, okay, and we have a trade deficit, okay, like our current situation, right? So good news, we got the unemployment figure back today, and in the month of June, we added 4.8 million non-ag sector jobs, which was way better than what was estimated, and unemployment rate fell from 13.3% to 11.1%, so and that is good news relatively, but we still have a lot of unemployment, and we definitely still have trade deficit. So if this is the case, and we depreciate our currency, right, we depreciate the dollar, what's going to happen is then that will make American products cheaper to foreigners, so our export industry will be able to expand, and they can actually hire the idle labor, right, the unemployed folks. So in that case, Y can increase without A changing, right? People don't have to buy anything any less domestically necessarily, okay? But in fact, it could even occur that with the depreciation of the dollar, foreign products will seem more expensive, so we'll even have more domestic consumption. But nonetheless, okay, with the unemployment situation, Y can increase while A does not have to change, or it can change just a little, right? Let's just say it doesn't change much, then that means our trade balance can indeed improve, okay? So this case means this will work, okay, to improve trade balance, okay? So I should say depreciation, well, depreciation of the dollar, right, will work to improve trade balance. Now, if we actually have full employment, okay, full employment doesn't mean zero unemployment. It just means zero cyclical unemployment, right? And again, this is something from Econ 151. I hope you can recall. Okay, if we have full employment and we have trade deficit, we want to improve. Okay, you can see that, well, if that's the case, okay, then when we depreciate the dollar, okay, so depreciation of the dollar, when that happens, okay, foreigners want to buy more products from America, but we already hit our full production capacity. So Y does not have any more room to grow. Y is fixed, okay? But in the meantime, okay, depreciation of the dollar will actually cause foreign products to be more expensive. So we'll buy less. We'll spend more domestically, so A will increase. Well, if Y doesn't change and A increases, that will actually cause B to become smaller or worse, right? So in this case, when we have full employment, depreciation of the dollar actually leads to, okay, worse trade balance. So it will not work, okay? So from the absorption approach, then we say, okay, depreciating our currency will work to help us only when we have unemployment. Okay, so only when our economy is not at full employment. Okay, all right. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay, the third approach to look at this is monetary approach. Okay, so the monetary approach is to look at how currency depreciation may induce temporary improvements in your trade balance, but overall, though, okay, it is the adjustments in your currency valuation will actually be countered by your monetary adjustments. Okay, so what I mean by that is, well, when you depreciate your currency, right? So depreciation of the dollar, okay? So initially that might improve your trade balance, but we know that is going to lead to inflation, right? Increased price level, because your depreciation of the dollar is going to cause imports to be more expensive. So overall, your dollar is going to improve. Your price level is going to increase. When you have increase in the dollar, then that means there's going to be an increase in money demand, right? Because sorry, not the dollar. When you have an increase in the price level, I should say, inflation, people are going to need more money to make transactions happen. Well, if you recall, okay, if this is the money market, we have interest rate as the price of money. Here's the quantity money, and this is your money supply, and this is your money demand. Okay, so when money demand increases because of inflation, okay, then you can see your interest rate is going to increase. So that leads to a higher interest rate. Well, a higher interest rate leads to, okay, inflow of foreign capital, right? So inflow of money. Inflow of money leads to what? Well, inflow of money leads to appreciation of the dollar. Right? So that means then eventually your impact on trade deficit improvement from your depreciation of the dollar will be wiped out. Okay, so that's the monetary approach, which says, yeah, temporarily it works, but it's not a long-term solution. Okay, all right. So that is chapter 13. I hope things make sense. Again, if not, write your questions down, and we'll talk about them in class on Wednesday. Now let's look at chapter 14. Okay, chapter 14 is about exchange rate systems and currency crises. Okay, so now there are different types of exchange rate regimes or systems in the world. Okay, and in the two far ends of the spectrum, you have fixed exchange rate, and then over here you have floating. Oops. Okay, floating or flexible exchange rate, and this is the whole regime. And then in the middle you have managed to float. Okay, or a crawling peg, right? So all sorts of different systems that countries can choose to have, and we will talk about the pros and cons of the major ends of the spectrum, and so you can understand what is going on. Okay. Now, in choosing an exchange rate system, a nation must decide whether to allow its currency to be determined by market forces, so that's the floating end, or to be fixed or pegged against some standard of value. Okay, the standard value can be a major currency, can be a bundle of currencies, or can be gold, but there's something else that you want to anchor your value against in your currency. Okay, now there are all sorts of systems out there, and the bottom line, the IMF, the International Monetary Funds, requires for their members are a few things, just three things to consider, right? They say your exchange rates should not be manipulated for two purposes, right? One, it should not be manipulated to prevent effective balance of payments adjustments. So what we just talked about in chapter 13, right? Even if you figure out intentionally devaluating your currency will help you with your balance of payments, and you should not do that according to the IMF. Okay. Two is that it should not be adjusted to gain unfair competitive advantage over other members of IMF. They don't care about the non-members. There are only very few. Okay. Now, also they say members should act to counter short-term disorderly conditions in exchange markets. That's okay. Okay. And but when you do that, you cannot. You have to take into account of the interests of other members, so make sure whatever you do is not going to hurt other people, other countries, right? So that's kind of the basic idea, like just the golden rule, right? Don't do anything to others that you don't want done to yourself, essentially. Okay. Now, the IMF, if you want to, you can Google their classification of different exchange rate systems. There are dozens and dozens of different ones. So you can look at different countries and with their different systems. However, when the country comes to choosing a specific system, there are a few things they need to consider, and specifically, there's something called the impossible trinity. Okay, the impossible trinity refers to the fact that countries cannot have free capital flows, okay, with independent monetary policy, and fixed exchange rate. So you cannot allow capital to flow and make your own policy, monetary policy, and completely control the value of your exchange rate, your currency. This is called the impossible trinity, right? So you can only choose two out of the three. And the US chooses these two, where we have free capital flow and independent monetary policy. As a result, we have to allow our currency to be floating in exchange rate. Okay, let me tell you what I mean by that, right? So let's say that we decide to have a contractionary monetary policy, which means, again, in the money market, you have interest rate and the amount of money, right? This is money demand, and this is money supply, okay? Call it MS1. A contractionary monetary policy means you have lower money supply, okay, for whatever reason, but as a result, we know this will cause the interest rate to rise, okay? Now, if we want to have the freedom to choose to manipulate our own money supply like this, and we want to have foreign capital flowing into our economy, right? Because when the interest rate rises, we know foreign money is going to increase. Well, if that's the case, foreign money increasing means more foreigners will try to buy the dollar, and the dollar will have to appreciate. Okay, and if we try to fix the value of the dollar, then we are not allowing any shifts in supply and demand in the foreign exchange market. As a result, foreigners will not be able to buy American assets. So since we want to have independent monetary policy and allow capital to flow in and out of our country, then we have to give up the fixed exchange rate and allow the exchange rate to be floating. Okay. Now China, on the other hand, okay, chooses to have independent monetary policy and fixed exchange rate. They want to have complete control of the value of their currency. As a result, they cannot allow capital flows to happen. Okay, and this is something actually China has been criticized over the years, saying that you're not opening up your financial sector to foreign companies and not allow capital to flow freely. And it's not that they don't want to; it's because they cannot get that, given the fact that they want to have monetary policy and fixed exchange rate, right? So if they allow the capital to flow to happen, they either have to give up their fixed exchange rate or not have any control of their own monetary policy. They decided to hold on to those two, so they had to give up the capital flow. Now, Hong Kong, on the other hand, okay, allows free capital flow, and they peg their currency value to the dollar. So as a result, Hong Kong cannot have their own monetary policy. They have to just allow however much money is needed in the market, with the dollar's fluctuation causing their Hong Kong dollars supply and demand fluctuation to occur. Okay, so that's the impossible trinity, and that's what one major thing that countries have to figure out when they decide what type of system they want to have. Okay, now let's talk about, first of all, the fixed exchange rate system and the pros and cons and how it works. Okay, so this type of system is primarily used by small developing nations with currencies that are not commonly traded. Usually their currency is not accepted very much, and then also usually they have just one or few major countries they trade with, or major currencies that their trade partners use. So as a result, okay, they anchor the value of their currency to one or a few key currencies to have a fixed exchange rate system. Okay, and so these key currencies they pick are usually widely traded on the world money markets, and also they have demonstrated relatively stable values over time, and then they're widely accepted as means of international settlement. So that way, a small country can figure out exactly how much their trade power is and the value of their currency in international trade, and how much how many dollars they can exchange, for example, right? So almost 64% of these small countries practicing fixed exchange rate systems peg their currency against the dollar. Okay, about 20% peg against the euro, and then some other major currencies are picked here and there, mostly because those are the major trade partners with these smaller countries. Okay, now you can also, many of them, these small countries, instead of picking one currency, can peg their value against the special drawing right. Remember that bundle of 5 different currencies we talked about a few chapters ago? Okay, so now when you have a fixed exchange rate system, then that means you cannot allow market fluctuation to alter your currency value. So what you need to do is to perform what's called exchange rate stabilization. Okay, so exchange rate stabilization. Okay, and that means these countries have to have an exchange rate stabilization fund to do that. So they have to have enough reserves of the currency they're pegged against to manipulate the market, for example, right? So let's say, if this is, I don't know, let's see, the peso, okay, versus the dollar, right? So Mexican peso versus the dollar. The peso used to be pegged against the dollar. I think, well, it is still pegged, but it's not completely pegged. It's a management float now, if I remember correctly. But anyway, so this is then measured in how many dollars, because this is from Mexico's perspective, right? So you have then demand for dollars and supply for dollars. And let's say the market normally would say it should be 20 pesos, okay, per dollar. But, okay, let's say that the Mexican government likes 15, right? They want to be at 15 pesos per dollar. So you can see at 15, okay, the supply of dollars is low and the quantity demanded of dollars is high, right? So because 15 pesos per dollar, people who hold dollars and say, I don't want to exchange for pesos, that's not a fair price. But people with pesos will say, I want to get dollars because that's really good deal. So you have this shortage of dollars, okay? And to maintain this, that means the Mexican government will have to make up this shortage by using their exchange rate stabilization funds and the dollars they've accumulated over time to put into the market and make up this difference and satisfy this shortage for dollars. So they have to fork dollars out into the foreign exchange market to maintain this 15 pesos per dollar deal, this target price. Okay, and so over time, they cannot do this forever. So they might have to either adjust their what's called par value, or or have some other supply and demand shifts to help them stabilize their currency. So it's very difficult to fix a value that is not close to the market equilibrium, right? All right, so with the fixed exchange rate system, okay, your book also talks about some examples. Go ahead and read those and see if they can help you understand them. But the point is, used by small countries, and it's easier to control their trade balance that way, but the difficulty is to maintain this exchange rate if it is different than the market equilibrium, especially quite different. So over time, they might have to adjust. And of course, when the fixed rate is different than the market equilibrium, then usually the thinking is because, well, If you intentionally devalue your currency, meaning your exchange rate is higher than market equilibrium, that's more sustainable because that requires you to um, um, buy to print more of your own currency, supply it to the foreign exchange market, right? And that can potentially help you with your trade balance if you satisfy those different situations we talked about in chapter 13 about how devaluing your currency can help improve your trade balance. And now for countries that intentionally overvalue their currency, like this example we just show here, hypothetically, then that can help them with imports. Imports will become cheaper, right? So a lot of rich, smaller countries, especially like European nations, usually tend to overvalue their currency. So the euro tends to be overvalued, at least it used to be quite severely when it was first issued. So that is because the nature of the different countries and what they face. Okay, so now let's talk about the floating system. Okay, so the floating system, that's or flexible system, that's pretty easy to understand. You just reach market equilibrium in the foreign exchange market, and whatever that is, you let it happen, right? So now there are arguments for and against the floating system, right? So arguments for the floating system include, that this system can respond quickly to changes in supply and demand conditions. It clears the market of shortages and surpluses of a given currency. It's simplified so that we don't have to have any kind of institutional overview and monitoring of this market. Just let it happen, okay? And it will continue, have continuous adjustment to your balance of payments, so it should always be at zero, okay? And you're partially insulated you have partially insulated home economy from external forces, okay? And nations have greater freedom to pursue policies to promote domestic balance and etc. But then there are also arguments against the floating system. It says, unregulated market may lead to wide fluctuations in currency values and then discourage foreign trade investment because if your currency value is not stable, then that's a risk factor, right? And there can be an inflationary bias, right, where monetary authorities may lack financial discipline to just, keep spending and cause inflation to occur over time, okay? Or then, companies can face unnecessary risks in doing international trade. They don't know which way their currency is going to go, right? So that's the floating system, not too much to discuss compared to the fixed. But then we have also something called managed float. Okay, so a managed float is when you can alter the value of your currency within a certain range, right? So you allow, let's say, so now that's kind of what the Mexican peso and the US is doing, and dollar is doing, where you say, okay, and that's also what the Chinese yuan and American dollar is doing now. It used to be a hard peg. So when I was growing up in China, it was always 5.5 yuan per dollar. No matter what the dollar did, the yuan went up and down with it. But of course, we talked about the problem with that. So China went to a managed float system now. So it has a range saying, I don't know the exact numbers because they adjust it occasionally, but let's say it's anywhere between 6.5 yuan per dollar to 7.5 yuan per dollar. So within this range, the yuan can freely adjust according to the market equilibrium. But if it gets out of this range, then the Chinese central bank can step in and use their stabilization fund to push it back to this range again. So that's called a managed float. And so you can see it's kind of a system that tries to take advantage of both the fixed and the float, the floating to have some kind of control, but also some kind of freedom. And your book talks more about the pros and cons and different terms related to this system, but I just wanted to give you the basic idea. Okay, and then finally we have something called the crawling peg. Okay, so the crawling peg is something that's you make small frequent adjustments in the par value of your currency to correct your balance of payment disequilibrium. And so you have eventually a target up here, but you don't want to have very sharp fluctuation in your exchange rate, so you just do it incrementally, right? That's called a crawling peg. And eventually you reach a zero balance on your BOP accounts. And so both managed float and crawling peg kind of are trying to combine flexibility with stability. So the best of the two systems, right? Okay. Now, finally, the last thing we want to talk about is currency crisis and currency manipulation wars, essentially, right? So a currency crisis happens when there's a speculative attack. Remember, if you remember in a few chapters ago, we talked about when it comes to currency speculation, you can have stabilizing speculation or destabilizing speculation. So this is when you destabilize a currency. And this usually happens when a weak currency experiences heavy selling pressure, okay? And that can be for different reasons. One can be, there's some kind of sizable losses in foreign reserves held by the country's central bank, or there's a depreciating exchange rate in the forward market, okay? And then people take the chance to speculate and destabilize your currency. So that's very dangerous for these small currencies, and a currency crisis can decrease the growth of GDP by 6% or more, okay? And a currency crisis ends when the selling pressure stops. Now, the ways to stop the selling pressure can be, you devalue your currency, right? You establish new exchange rates that are sufficiently depreciated, that have sufficiently depreciated your currency, so people don't want to sell your currency anymore because it's not worth much, right? And or you adopt a floating system to let the market guide, or you have some kind of imposition of restrictions on the ability of people to buy and sell foreign currencies, okay? Or you use a loan to bolster foreign reserves of your monetary authority, so you have enough to counteract the market selling pressure of your currency, okay? Or you restore the confidence in the existing rate, somehow come out and restore that confidence. But for currencies crises that end in devaluation, that's called a currency crash. That has happened to many countries throughout the history. You can read about Argentina, Germany, and Venezuela, right? So all these countries have experienced this. But anyway, so the most famous example, we already mentioned this before, was in 1997 when George Soros speculated against the Thai baht and caused the baht to depreciate by 60% and against the dollar, and that triggered a wave of speculation against other Southeastern Asian currencies and caused this huge economic downturn that plagued the region. And I remember living through that, and that was just in the news day in, day out for a long time. Many countries, many currencies ended up with a currency crash. So it took years for Asia to recover, but George Soros in this deal made billions of dollars. So anyway, if you go to Asia today, then there's still a lot of people that are very upset with him. Anyway, so that's kind of the key points in chapter 14. I hope things make sense. If not, again, write down your questions, and we'll talk about that on Wednesday. In the meantime, have a great 4th of July weekend. I will see you guys next week.